For anyone watching and listening in, we are going to get started soon. We are just making some final preparations. Jacob is currently getting ready for the long sit, so he'll be back here soon, and we'll get going. But thank you for your patience.
Way maybe.
All right, guys, we are back. We are going to get started here soon, but we wanted to do a quick audio test because we're really happy with where our audio is at the moment,
Yes.
and it's actually the podcast that ends our audio issues. I can knock on wood here, but we are finally hardware connected in to the computer, so there's no risk of connections dropping out.
A lot less jumping around networks, very stable connection. Lots of our cameras working, microphones working, all going to one input. Oh yeah, dude.
Exactly. You're probably going to want to bring, just based off of the levels I'm seeing here, you're probably going to want to bring your mic closer to
A little
you.
bit closer, like maybe right here.
And or maybe raise your gain up a tad.
Oh yeah, it definitely does need to be raised up a little bit. Okay, how about this?
That's much more in line with mine. That's
okay,
like perfect.
Nice. All right, here we go. We are all testing.
Now,
okay.
I want you to keep in mind that you generally test quieter than you talk. So you raise your volume, the volume of your voice as you get excited.
That is true.
And so you probably want to put the microphone back a little further than you think you're going to need to, and then just get closer if you're talking quieter.
Okay.
And
Out
then
here. Bend down in
um,
here.
and
Okay, I
then
can do that.
be aware that of like your volume too. We're probably going to need to test your sided volume.
Okay. Get the volume. Okay. Hey guys, and then this is something that I find really exciting. But then
Yeah,
this is
you're
something
branching into the yellow there, which is not bad. It's not necessarily bad, but like it's probably going to sound a little bit.
Yeah. I'm going to have it the gain just probably a tiny bit more down.
Okay.
Where okay, what about this? What about this right here?
It's barely branching into the yellow.
And I probably won't, my voice probably won't go that high. If I do talk, it'll be something more like this.
Right.
There we go. I don't know.
Yeah. That sounds good. I probably eventually need to put a limiter on our voices so that we can, you know, kind of keep those peaks from being a problem. Dude.
Camera. All right.
All right, guys, we are doing a visual test. On my end, from what I can see, we're
Looking
looking
pretty
really
good.
good. Yeah,
Nice.
we're looking spizzy, spazzy.
Okay.
Liking the new space.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not our new space. It is a new space, but it's not the one that we're ultimately going to end up at. But we did want to move here temporarily so that we could better manage a live stream, so that we could be directly hardwired into the computer.
Okay.
Give me 1 second moment now. We'll be back in a second, guys.
Hello, and welcome to ThetaWave Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Holland. I am a neuroscience researcher here with my wonderful co-host, Ryan Reed. Ryan Reed is a machine learning expert, a neuroscience researcher as well, singer, songwriter, playwright, as well as various other things. And Ryan, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, we have we're going to be covering our neuroscience topic today.
Ooh,
and
okay.
It's a really, really good one. And has a lot of kind of covers some very important parts of the
Basal ganglia.
Well, but
Yeah.
also the reward, system.
Yes.
So what area specifically, are we going to be going over within that?
So there is a very particular node at kind of the barrier between the frontal lobe and the limbic system, situated kind of next to the septum, which is kind of that structural support between the frontal cortex and various other more central components. And this is, you might have heard of it before, is the Nucleus Accumbens. And the Nucleus Accumbens is a very interesting little cluster of neurons. I tried to look for how many neurons are estimated to be in the Nucleus Accumbens, and I actually really couldn't find anything about it, which I thought was very interesting. And so I can't give an exact estimate as to how many neurons exactly are in this cluster of them, but it is small. It's a very small little region, kind of maybe around the same size, maybe a little bit smaller than your hypothalamus. And it's a central component in the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia, or the basal nuclei, are
known for being a part of the reward system, too, right?
Reward system and also action selection. So taking that reward and turning it into behavioral models that can be actualized into the real world for specific goals and purposes that then give you an intrinsic feeling of, particularly a dopaminergic feeling of wanting to go do something and then actually doing it. And this is primarily what the Nucleus Accumbens does. And it's fascinating because the Nucleus Accumbens is one of the most well-researched areas of the human brain. And it is sad, however, though, that all of that comes from preclinical work in animal models. And so a lot of the distinctions and inferences we made into the Nucleus Accumbens is mainly from animals. However, through different technologies like diffusion tractography, which is mapping out the white matter tracks within the brain, we've actually been able to distill a lot of the information we learned from preclinical models and translate that into human models, and how we can then translate that into, obviously, various drug interventions or deep brain stimulation, which we can get into. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about some probably regional distinctions we should make that will be pretty prevalent throughout the majority of this talk. So, primarily, it is distinguished into two main regions, both the shell and the core. Okay. And the shell is primarily associated with hedonic value. And so here there's a lot of less complex dendritic spines. It's very simple, with the majority of its connections coming from the limbic system. And it's specifically a part of the extended amygdala complex. And so it has very high levels of emotional significance. And it's associated primarily with evaluating emotional salience and also the potential stimulus you could have. And so also that's related to how pleasurable a specific action or object is in relation to you. And this is kind of where you get also like associative rewards. It's like if a particular event happens that then has a stimulus that is pleasurable, then you associate those together and they can both activate this kind of just automatic pleasure response. And this is mediated by the shell. This is the outer region of the nucleus accumbens. And then obviously different areas when stimulated or differentiated, you can actually see how different areas do various things and give various like afferent, like go signals that are pleasurable, or avoidant signals, efferent. And it's actually very interesting. In the shell, there's a particular hedonic hotspot in the rostral or the front area of the nucleus.
What do you mean by hedonic? Do you want to explain
Hedonic. Oh yeah, sure. Hedonic pretty much just means immediate pleasurable stimulus. That's what it is. So there's no complex behavioral like significance or like action that you have to take that then gives you a dopaminergic drive to go get that. It is the actual hedonic pleasure of the stimulus itself. So there's no kind of go action. It's just the immediate liking of something. And that's also a very important distinction that we've modeled in the nucleus accumbens, is the liking versus the wanting. And so those sound very similar, but functionally they do very different things.
I would think that like the wanting something would, depending on the outcome of that reward, would then lead to the liking of something, or not lead to the liking of something.
Yeah.
So if I wanted something and I got it and I realized I didn't get what I thought I was going to get from it, that would lead to either, you know, a neutral or a dislike of the thing. And then if I wanted it and I got it and I got the reward I was expecting from it, that would lead to a liking it.
Yeah. And that kind of also touches on like reward prediction error and how those are calculated. And we'll get into that in a little bit. And I pretty much want you to think of the shell. Oh, one other thing about the hedonic hotspot, that immediate liking pleasure center, is when stimulated, there is a dramatic increase in the pleasurable feeling when you have sugar, for example, and other various immediate stimulus of like pleasurable feelings. But then when you go into like the immediate area surrounding that very particular hedonic hotspot, stimulating it actually makes you really dislike what you thought was pleasurable when stimulated in the hedonic hotspot. And so there's very particular kind of like structural differences in the connectivity patterns that then differentiate between liking versus disliking something within the shell. And so I pretty much want you to think of the shell as an evaluator. It's taking dense limbic connections, taking various deep limbic inputs, and it's evaluating that emotional stimulus and saying, okay, how much do we like this? But also, how much do we care about how much we like this? And that's a very vital
I imagine that would have an emotional component to it.
Yeah. And so this is like an emotional salience, reward salience evaluator. And so it's creating a model that integrates the emotional aspects of wanting something and has some other various interesting components as well that we'll get into, and the core as well. So the shell, this is the liking. How much do I like this? And how much do I care about the liking aspect of this? How much relevance does it have to my actual survival or environment that I want to actualize myself in? And that leads us to the actual core component. So there's the shell, and then there's the core, okay? So this has different types of connections. So you can actually see the shell has very simple dendritic spines. It's less dense and lower amounts of acetylcholine, for example, like the enzyme that produces it. There's less of it there. And also there's very,
And for those that don't know, acetylcholine is the neurochemical primarily responsible for long-term potentiation or our ability to adapt and learn.
yes, because this is more so associated with immediate pleasure, right? And emotional significance of something. And then obviously there's feedback loops that then refine those connections. And then the core has a lot denser dendritic spines, lots of very complex connections with a lot of various other parts of the brain.
Which
so
translates, again, for those who don't know, to more varied areas and regions that it can connect to, as well as more connection points usually.
And so when you actually look at the connectivity patterns, there's a lot of very dense connections to places like the ventral pallidum, for example, which is the primary nucleus accumbens output center that then relays the very refined information to the cortex and the limbic system, and then to the ventral tegmental area, which I'll explain what that is in a second. And
VTA.
Yes, the VTA. And the core, so you said the shell is the emotional evaluator. The core takes that evaluation and then translates it to specific behavioral programs that then make you able to go out and get that reward in the future.
Take action on it.
Yes, it is the action part of a potential reward. And what's interesting,
so it's almost like different action networks that can become associated with specific wanting concepts, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's where kind of like that liking versus wanting differentiation come from. The shell is more so liking, the core is more so wanting, the going after something,
the pull towards it.
And it's also where like operant conditioning occurs in the brain, where you have a behavioral output that is then modified by the consequences of it.
I assume that's also where a lot of addiction stems from as well.
Yes, that is actually one of the major key kind of inferences into the core. When you look at a deep brain stimulation of the shell versus the core, when you stimulate the shell, you actually have a reduction in addiction-seeking behavior, specifically for like cocaine. And when you stimulate the core, it doesn't have that effect. Actually, it's going to probably give more of a response to potential addictive substances. And so that's another differentiation there. And what's also very interesting about that is that there's a distinction to be made between the actual pleasure that an addictive drug can have, and then the addictive or the personal addiction of always needing it. Kind of like the crippling aspect of it is because even if it doesn't make you feel pleasure anymore, the core is still being activated by environmental cues that then drive you to get that substance or whatever you're addicted to, even if there's no pleasure in the shell associated with it.
And I assume that also has to do with adjustment of your base, like your baselines and your the factor of, even if the improvement doesn't bring you above your baseline like it normally did, it still brings you closer to your baseline. So
yeah, exactly. And so you can, for addiction in this kind of way, you want to look at it from just a survival perspective. In your circuitry, what it thinks is that what that substance isn't an issue at all. Even if your higher order executive functions know that this is a problem, your core thinks that these stimulus cues are actually a solution to the drop in the baseline state. And so even if there
It's
are
almost like a fight between your
yeah.
your higher level cortex cognitive processes and your lower
Mhm.
level uh, instinctual kind of components.
Yeah. And there's no there hasn't been any time for our neurobiology to adapt to that type of overriding of natural baseline states,
Mm.
because well the prevalence of potential addicting substances is so much more than it ever has been in the past. And so it's probably going to take another 50,000 to 100,000 years before we're able to really be able to grab hold and make sure that we are communicating well between those that pleasure state and the wanting and the executive inhibition of it.
That's assuming that we live that long.
Assuming if we live that long, or maybe it's something that we'll just have to, really struggle with while the future generations
I
can really
wonder
take hold
if
of.
that is a another kind of added reason in the conglomeration of reasons that the human cortex and logical processing seems to have adapted and improved so quickly over the past century
Hmm.
or so. But like with the information age, I'm sure has a lot to do with that. But I wonder also if there's a component of, with all these new substances that now have the the ability to influence brain function on a really low level, the cortex is needing to have more control,
Hmm.
and be able to exert more control over those.
Yeah, yeah, and that's uh, particularly mediated by like two or three nuclei within like the interior cingulate cortex. And so I think that I don't in my research there wasn't any significant correlations within the interior cingulate cortex and the nucleus accumbens, which could be why the translation there and synchrony between having the best ways of handling with addiction aren't exactly very just biologically available, if that makes sense. But that doesn't mean that we can't overcome addiction, obviously. And there are various, therapeutic ways, but also ways to take hold of it yourself by finding alternative solutions that can, even if you have to struggle significantly in the first couple of weeks or days or months, you can find alternative solutions to bring you back to baseline state so that there is no longer a dissociation between the shell and the core of the nucleus accumbens.
And also that's a testament to anyone out there that has overcome some sort of addiction. You People that have overcome addiction, they should be proud of their cortex. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's a major feat to be able to use higher order executive control over
Yeah.
those lower level processes that are harder to control.
And what's great is that it's we actually are able to do that fine for the most part, because the majority of the actual executive connections um to the specifically the prefrontal cortex, um uh, in the medial prefrontal cortex, the prelimbic system, right? Yeah, it's the prelimbic system, which mediates like conditioned fear responses. And so there is some sort of like executive self-regulation you can have that will then be able to have some sort of like fear extinction of the necessary, or like the feeling of having this need for the substance that your core is saying is reliant on survival. And so you can actually mediate that. It's just not necessarily like the core component, because it's not just a relevant um it hasn't been as relevant for our survival, but probably will be in the future. But anyways, so the core, right? It's taking that emotional evaluation, that hedonistic feeling of pleasure, and then your core is taking that and then translating it into very specific behavioral programs, and it's basically an action selection system. And then it has very dense connections also to like the motor cortex, the premotor cortex, the sensory motor cortex, pretty much regulating the specific types of behavioral outputs in relation to a goal you can have. And one thing I should mention that is probably very important is that 95% of your nucleus accumbens neurons are medium spiny neurons. Okay, and these are projection neurons into obviously the various regions that we've talked about, the cortex, the limbic system, and various other regions that I'll get into in a bit. And these
projection neurons are cross-regional neurons.
Yes, cross-regional neurons. And what's interesting is that, okay, talk about the nucleus accumbens. Okay, what do we know it's associated with primarily? What do we know as? Okay, it's reward, it's pleasure. You would think that would be responsible mainly for like a very much like a go signal of like excitation, right? But
go speed race.
These medium spiny neurons are actually GABAergic, and so 95
inhibitory.
Yeah, so GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, is a inhibitory neuron, as opposed to glutamate, which is the main excitatory. What did I say? Did I say
neuron?
Oh, oops. Yeah, neurochemical, as opposed to glutamate, that is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. And so GABA is sending out these inhibitory projections to all of these various regions in the brain and the basal ganglia at large. And that might seem counterintuitive at first, because it's like, okay, so primarily this is an inhibition system. It seems like it would be more so about stopping as opposed to like going and pursuing goals. Well,
I was going to say that in essence, they can be that way by choosing to release their or not fire, or essentially by the act of kind of tuning it in a kind of almost in a negative sense to the way it would normally be tuned. It can be essentially release certain neurons and give them the ability to fire, as well as enhance the input signal through inhibiting neuron, like other neurons that are not necessary, so that the signal can kind of be forced down specific pathways, right?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Is that when you think about the actual behavioral translation, there are so many potential ways that you can pursue a goal, but you have to evaluate it and find a very particular distilled configuration of actions that you take. And so it has to very much inhibit all of the other potential roles that it can have. And so this is done through the GABAergic system and the MSNs, which is what I'm going to call the medium spiny neurons. And one thing that we haven't touched on is, well, where's the primary signals that start to project these GABAergic signals? And a lot of the signals come, majority of them, the primary connection is in the ventral tegmental area, the VTA.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry to break your train of thought there.
I can hold it. Good.
These medium spiny neurons, I'm blanking, are these different than pyramidal neurons, or are they the same?
I don't want to say anything that I'm not 100% sure. There,
Okay.
I
Because my understanding was that pyramidal neurons are like,
yes.
A major part of that
Hmm.
reward system, and also,
Yeah.
very, somewhat dense in those areas, which would also make sense for chandelier cells, which are, um, uh,
Oh my God. What is it
whoops,
even looking at?
I'm not sure. I'll fix it
Hold
though.
on. You
Don't,
just.
no, I can control it
Okay,
over
great.
here if I need to. Which are also primarily, solely GABA.
Hmm.
So that kind of inhibitory, signal connection on the post, uh, the or the pre-axon, terminal, um, there from the chandelier cells, could be a major component of regulating those excitatory connections from the pyramidal
Yeah.
cells across regions.
Hmm. If I were to
Because
guess,
pyramidal cells work across regions too. Like, I'm thinking those are probably at least similar, if not the same.
yeah, I'm I'm pretty sure that they are in and of themselves a particular type of neuron with different uh, structural differences than pyramidal neurons. But I do know that there are dense uh, pyramidal uh, signals that release glutamate from the prefrontal cortex into the nucleus accumbens. So there is definitely there's a pyramidal component in there, but it's to my understanding, there the MSNs are morphologically differentiated from pyramidal neurons. And people can fact check me on that, but they they're they're definitely different from either glutamatergic um, pyramidal neurons. Um, but there is very rich and diverse glutamatergic pyramidal signals that have very deep interplays with the nucleus accumbens. And so I'm definitely not going to say that there isn't a lot of correlation there, because there 100% is. Um, but so interestingly enough, the ventral tegmental area, which I was talking about, I want you to think of the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, as the dopamine production factory of the brain. And so this is where the primary dopaminergic input into the nucleus accumbens and various other brain regions comes from, and the basal ganglia. So I should also mention that for all of you listeners who are probably who are a little more knowledgeable of the subject, that yes, the nucleus accumbens is in the ventral striatum, apart with the olfactory tubercle, which has some interesting implications, but it's just part of that, so you know. And the ventral tegmental area is sending these dopaminergic signals to the nucleus accumbens, and there are two particular types of dopamine expressions that it sends: D1 and D2 types.
Mm.
And the interplay between these two are very intricate and complex, because when you look at the ventral striatum, a lot of the previous assumptions about the functionality of D1 and D2 dopamine receptors, or dopamine neurotransmitters, or no, sorry, receptors. Yes, sorry, was presupposed based on the dorsal striatum, the caudate, and the putamen, which is relevant for
Which is a great name, by the way.
yes, the putamen.
The putamen.
Dopamine, yes. And this is all about like sensory motor, motor system selection. And so when it's much more easily accessible by different
And
scanning techniques.
Probably, I would imagine more easily adjustable too than D3 or D4, D5, and
Yeah.
potentially D3s.
hmm And so when you look at the D1 and D2 receptors in the ventral striatum, sorry, not the ventral, the dorsal striatum, what we see a very easy distinction, very simple distinction of D1 receptors. When those get excited, they send a go signal. And when you look at the D2 signals, they send a no-go signal. So you have a go signal, no-go signal. Very simple. And that's what we thought was what we thought was happening in the ventral striatum too, because, well, this is how it works over here. And so, and there's a lot of physiological reasons to like have that go no go model, because D1 receptors, when they get bind to by dopamine, they increase the production of adenyl cyclase, and so there's increased C-amp levels, which create an environment of more neuronal excitability. And then D2 do the opposite; they inhibit adenyl cyclase, and so there's less neuronal excitability, and so there's this action and also suppression happening. And it was very easy to visualize and see within the dorsal striatum. And we said, great, okay, since these are the same receptors that are within the nucleus accumbens, we're going to just presuppose that this is the exact same thing.
Which was an incorrect assumption, because the different receptors, some will take on different functionalities based off of the region that they're in.
Yeah. And through different techniques, we've seen that there are estimated. It depends on the technique used to find the specific gene expressions of these neurons, but there's around 16 different subtypes for D1 and D2 receptors within the nucleus accumbens. And that can give you kind of a hint at that there's so much more diversity within these particular dopaminergic subtypes. And when that was kind of realized, we had to kind of change our model of how we understood D1 and D2 expression in the nucleus accumbens.
Which, by the way, as a side note for our audience, I was recently looking actually at 3D imaged and scanned models of the D1 and D2 receptors, and it's super fascinating to look at. So when we get our, eventually get our website up and running, we will have a section on there for nootropics and neuroscience and machine learning, and within these sections, we will try and create these visual representations so you can see what we're talking about. And like, for instance, in the nootropics section, if something interacts with like the D1 receptors or the D receptors, we'll embed a model of those receptors so you guys can take a look at that and kind of get a little bit of a sense visually of what that looks like.
Dude, I'm actually really excited for that website to go up. I think it's going to be great, and just an amazing resource. And I mean, at least for me personally, just a wonderful way of just really getting into the intricate details of like, making sure I really know how these interactions work. And
also, kind of that whole concept of being able to map out in a 3D model of these structures, as well as their knowing their specific, chemical properties, their polarities and whatnot, gives us a way almost to simulate molecule and small molecule interactions
Mm-hmm.
with these structures. So now we know, okay, so this is the, these are the properties of this chemical, these are the properties of this receptor, and this is the structure of this receptor and the structure of this chemical. How would those two things interact with each other potentially, by running almost like simulations on these, which could be combined with something like AI, could be a huge benefit to the field of of medical neuroscience and disease management and
Oh
caring
yeah,
and whatnot.
absolutely. I 100% agree with that. I'm very excited to just get into the details of that, and maybe even contribute to like you said. Yeah. And then go and see where that goes, and then maybe have a lot of very interesting aha moments that give us a dopaminergic drive to explore a different path.
So back to the D1, D2 receptors,
Yes.
and the kind of different functionality they take on within these specific areas of the reward system.
So when you look at the core, the signals, the dopaminergic signals coming from the ventral tegmental area are very stable, and they have very particular firing patterns. They stay around 5 to 10 hertz, and it's consistent, and make sure that you have a very asynchronous and very accessible information pattern for the behavioral output related to the goals and that you have. And one thing that I forgot to mention is that, think of the thalamus, for example. This is an information integration center. It's taking very raw data and turning it into very what am I looking for? Distilled,
actionable.
Yeah, like a highly processed information.
Right. So distilled, filtered.
Yeah, filtered. And it's taking this filtered process information and then relating that to literally every single brain structure there is. And that's where the raw data is.
It's almost like a routing manager.
Yeah, it's like a routing manager. And then it routes all of that more processed information to its most relevant areas to do with it as it will. And then that becomes much more highly processed. And then in the medial prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the ventral hippocampus, all of these other places that are receiving this processed information are then making it more highly processed, and then they're sending it to the nucleus accumbens. And so the nucleus accumbens is receiving very highly processed, distilled information from the cortex and the limbic system, and as well as like the various motor systems as well. And it creates this very high level integration center of all of the various signals coming from your executive center, kind of more of like your life planning, the self, your sense of self, your wants, your needs, your goals in life. That's being generated by your executive functions, but is then actualized into the pleasurable experience of potentially getting that goals, and then creating the behavioral outputs for that, and then as well as integrating the emotional component, how your limbic system feels about that.
It sounds almost like this area is the key, or one of the key components that lets you connect your internal self to your external body.
Yes.
And your sensory experience, you know, like it's what allows you to operate in a physical sense.
Yeah.
You know.
And when you look at like papers that go over like an overview or like a functional review of the nucleus accumbens, it'll say that the nucleus accumbens is the interface, the action that correlates your emotions with movement. It's the limbic-motor interface. And I didn't say that at the beginning because I wanted to also emphasize its very prominent connections with your executive functions as well. And so there's almost like this triad connectivity bridge that all merges into one and then kind of has a bidirectional communication.
Any time that your emotions are involved, it's going to connect in some form or another to your executive functions, because even if it's a little bit of processing, there's still going to be some processing.
Because there are also various other routes that aren't through the nucleus accumbens that are also translating emotional and executive states and making sure that those are correlated to some degree.
Can you imagine how we would be as human beings without the executive function part of that system? So like without the ability to filter those emotions, if it was just like the emotion to the raw emotion, like to the action and reward scenario, like that would be pure chaos.
It would be actually insane, because you would get the immediate like emotional visceral reaction, then an immediate behavioral output that is solely based on just how you feel emotions in that moment. Yeah, which actually is like there is like disorders that are similar to that.
Yeah,
if there's lesions,
there's even there's even like personalities that are more similar to that are like more emotion based, like with less processing that happens before action is taken.
If you think about it, your executive functions can either serve your emotional state or it can have a stable altruistic relationship with it. And if it serves the limbic system, it's only going to amplify and maybe characterize to better navigate the modern day world we live in, but is just going to serve a more emotional purpose and then create behavioral programs through the nucleus accumbens and translate to action.
The question is, like, almost in a personality sense, is your executive system, is that a slave to the to your emotional centers, limbic system, your amygdala, like whatever, is it a slave to your emotional system? Is it an altruistic equal partner relationship, or is the limbic an emotional system a slave to the executive? And like there are varying levels of that like relationship. Like I know for me and my brain and my personality, it's probably more of a emotional slave. Like the emotional system is probably more of a slave to my executive system, and the executive system gets priority and dominance in most scenarios there.
And I genuinely think that's probably the best way to go about things, because your emotional status or salience is then going to be what's translating into a pleasurable feeling that then gives you that dopaminergic drive. And so if you can kind of make that function serve your executive wants and needs, then you pretty much have complete, at least to some degree, a level of mastery over your drives that can give you pleasurable experiences. And so you have more a controlled action selection with primary dopaminergic drives that are able to actualize into the world. And so if you can make the limbic system serve your executive function, then I think, at least relevant to your motivational states, that's going to give you such incredible.
Let's take a second and kind of find a good place to transition to a quick break, because software just notified me that there was some sort of feedback detected.
Okay.
And so I just want to check out our audio. And
make sure that,
absolutely. That things are working properly.
So once we get back, I'm going to go into a little bit more of the detail between the functional difference of D1 and D2, as well as the receptors or the neurons that express both D1 and D2 receptors and how that affects learning and memory.
Ooh.
Yes,
All right.
so stay tuned for that.
We'll be back in just a couple minutes.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see you then.
Hello. Oh yeah. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, I realized I was back from my mic.
Oh wait,
I hope
yeah.
it was able to catch all that.
You want to restart it
Um,
or
sure, for the sake of the recording, in
yeah?
case that didn't
Mm-hmm.
that didn't translate. Welcome back to ThetaWave podcast, part 2 of the Nucleus Accumbens,
Oh yeah.
and we are going to be finishing covering this fascinating brain region that is
Mm-hmm.
really central to everything that we know and
Yeah.
as being human.
Yeah. Really.
And just very very interconnected component. We're talking
Mm-hmm.
about how it even like is one of the main reasons we have a connection between our physical self and our internal
Yeah.
self.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Jacob, why don't you continue and take us off?
Okay. Yeah. So we discussed, the main components, how it's an integration hub between executive functions, your motor system, your limbic interface, like you said, and takes all of that and then transforms it into a behavioral program. And the direct stimulation is mainly mediated by dopaminergic inputs from the ventral tegmental area that give its functional ability to regulate behavioral programs, and as well as your emotional state and your pleasure, as well as like the cued responses to conditioned stimulus as well. So back to D1 and D2 receptor subtypes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so from the dorsal striatum, we thought that D1 was all about go, appetitive behavior, right? And then D2 was about no-go, aversive behavior. And that has changed significantly recently. And it's not necessarily wrong.
It just plays a different role
Mm-hmm.
in specific regions than it does in others.
Exactly. And it's a very simple model that can help you give an intuitive understanding about it. But even then, for me personally, I wish I didn't learn that model first, because it takes away from, like you said, the beautiful, diverse complexity that it has versus the other regions that have these D1 and D2 subtypes. And so for D1 specifically, it is about the go aspect of our behavior, about the regulation of the behavioral programs that we're actually doing. And so this is about these D1
stimulatory.
Yes, these stimulatory signals that then send GABAergic projections to regulate the specific behavioral program that we are currently immersed in.
Which is a fascinating concept in and of itself.
Yeah.
The fact that a D1 stimulatory signal can actually be sent to a GABA receptor,
Mm-hmm.
which then releases an inhibitory signal.
Yeah.
It's like we think of stimulatory, like especially with the D receptors, dopamine.
Mm-hmm.
Think of stimulatory as always being making a network active or more active, which it can do, but it can do it oftentimes through this kind of secondary inhibition.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the fact that these GABAergic neurons have D1 and D2 receptors that then send these very inhibitory signals to the rest of the brain. And what's also interesting is that these GABAergic signals also have direct connection to the ventral tegmental area. And so the nucleus accumbens is actually self-regulating its own dopaminergic input. And so it itself is evaluating how much dopamine it actually needs for a specific program that is trying to, or computation that it's trying to achieve. And so that's also interesting. That's just dopamine in general, not specific to D1, but also D2 as well. And D2, yes, it is associated with aversive behavior. That is one of its functional properties, but it's only one of its functional properties. We can actually see that there's also D2 activity in the nucleus accumbens that's associated with approaching behavior, with approaching something, not necessarily just like inhibiting a sorry, I shouldn't say inhibiting. It's not just involved in condition like responses to like stay away from something while pursuing something else. It is something that it's doing, but also we've actually seen that is also involved in approach behavior alongside D1 and D2. So that is another kind of layer of complexity there, is that we can actually see that it's kind of, it has a much more symbiotic or synergistic relationship with D1 receptors than previously thought.
I zoned out. Can you take a step back for a second and cover that symbiotic relationship again?
Oh yeah. So pretty much I was just saying, D1 is go, D2 is aversive behavior, but as well as approach behavior as well. And
approach behavior.
So also reward seeking. And so it's not just about, because D2 receptors were thought to put like a brake on getting something. So let's say like there's a negative.
So a want.
Yeah. So like a negative stimulus is associated with a particular thing. The D2 receptors were mediating the aversive behavior of getting away from that negative stimulus. And that was kind of the simple.
How does it achieve the approach like behavior? So like the desiring something, the want for something. How does it achieve that part of it? You know?
Because it's not just the properties of D2 receptors aren't fully, they're not structurally configured to just do that, if that makes sense. I don't know. It's when I did my research, it was all about animal studies that were watching both the expressions of D1 and D2, and noticed that D2 expression actually was associated.
So it didn't cover the...
No, it sadly didn't cover that. That is something that I would really like to get into, is the actual physiological properties.
Like, I know that, and I know with reasonable certainty that a lot of that has to do with the normal, unexpected, like, kind of dopamine levels and the and how that like will kind of almost pull you to try and normalize that level, or at least reach expected expected levels. But I'm just not really familiar with the exact mechanisms of what stimulates that wanting portion of that signal, as opposed to kind of almost an inhibitory approach.
I can give you a not as technical answer.
Maybe we can cover the D receptors in another
that
podcast
would actually be very interesting, like the D1 all the way up to D5.
Or even just covering them each individually.
That's definitely something I would be very interested in, and probably something I should know more about just in general.
Well, there's a lot there to know, and a lot that's not known about this stuff. So it is sometimes hard to kind of make sure you have a full picture when the full picture isn't always known.
Yeah, a lot of the big implications from understanding the technical details are very cutting edge and not fully characterized by their properties yet.
Yeah.
And definitely diving into that would be great. But a non-technical answer would be that when you look at the fMRI scans and and observing in rat models, the D2 receptors are more so involved in approach behavior of the alternative behavioral paths that could be taken and generated in the actual motor programs that could be generated that are different from the main path that you are currently taking. And so this has to do with the reward prediction error of the function of the nucleus accumbens. So you can think of it as, D1 as creating this behavioral program that it has relative certainty that it will be successful. It is the approach to get a particular reward, and then based on the incoming information from all of these various, from the thalamus, the ventral hippocampus is sending like spatial and contextual information about the environment that are giving it particular signals to configure itself, and it's all kind of converging to get that particular behavioral program. And then the D2 receptors are exploring alternative paths that are maybe closer related or even very different.
Essentially kind of like almost like a similar effect to adding noise within a reinforcement learning reward system.
Yes.
Instead of just having it find the best specific path that works, and then having it like kind of always, take that path in that scenario, you apply a certain level of what is called exploration, which is often achieved through noise.
Yes.
That allows sometimes for other options to be able to be chosen,
Exactly. The D2 receptors are kind of all about behavioral flexibility, and we can actually see that in lesions in the caudal medial, the medial caudal section of the core is where there's it's more associated with aversive and D2 like expression. It's very much excited, and there's a lot more action going on there when there is high levels of uncertainty or high levels of surprise. If an environment is very stable and very predictable, if something unexpected happens, then your D2 receptors go crazy. And what's interesting about that is that there's 40% of the medium spiny neurons in the shell region are about, it's kind of the evaluation of your state, right? 40% of them express both D1 and D2 receptors on them. And so in order for them to be to create an action potential, it needs both D1 and D2 dopamine inputs. And when these are activated, it also co-expresses BDNF. And so, this brain-derived nootropic
potentially
factor
create essentially almost potentially initializing an environment in which new actions can be learned.
Yes, exactly. So D2 receptors are more about being able to have flexible options and making sure that even if it's in a very stable environment that you've already learned, you can adapt to it.
Also is fascinating and has sparked something I need to file away for further analysis in my head, given our conversation that we were having earlier, about self-optimizing networks and whatnot, and seems to have a lot of potential relevance and maybe give guidance on, at least from a biological sense, how that's achieved.
And it's mainly through the nucleus accumbens regulating the GABAergic projections back to the ventral tegmental area. And so if, let's say, you're in a very certain, very predictable environment and something very unexpected happens, that is then going to inhibit the inhibition more so of dopaminergic signals to then be sent to the nucleus accumbens for a better environment of learning how to navigate this this kind of unexpected stimulus that happened. And so it's so interesting. And this is kind of done through like a reward prediction error model. So the actual reward, so like the RPE is calculated by the actual reward just minus the expected reward. And so if like let's say on a scale of like -10 to 10, if the expected reward is a 5 and the actual reward is also a 5, you're gonna get zero amount of surprise, because it's it was true, and that is going to associate with like a stronger consolidation of a specific cues that can give a behavioral program that can be repeated. But if, let's say, the predicted reward is like an 8, and you get like a -8, well then that is going to cause such a significant shift in what you actually evaluated. And so there's going to then be very, like you said, high levels of noise that are going to be sent to back into the nucleus accumbens to facilitate that learning. And then it's different in like highly volatile like environments. And so if you're not really sure what's going to happen, then there's always like a baseline state of like very high amounts of noise that go there. And that's just relevant to the uncertainty of the environment that you're in. So higher levels of initial uncertainty are going to facilitate less surprise, but more noise. That is going to facilitate learning. And then the opposite is true. There's higher
almost
certainty.
A Bayesian component to that.
Yes, it's kind of what's emerging currently in our computational models of the nucleus accumbens, is understanding it through like a Bayesian perspective. And it's very interesting, because that's very relevant to how we can understand how the nucleus accumbens distributes the actual probability of actions being the best possible one that then achieve the reward. And these highly differentiated, like the shell and the core, and then the subregion specific to very particular expressions within it, can correlate with very local regions that are self-analyzing the expected reward and the certainty of it, and then communicating through a probability distribution, and then attenuating it and converging it into a potential value that it thinks is the most correct. And it does this through so many different connectivity patterns through the various regions that are involved in critical thinking, and as well as like the previous memories, and learned behavioral responses, and integrate that, and find either new novel paths or other ways that are correspondent with other environments. And it does this to particularly minimize the uncertainty, so that you can be certain to to the most degree possible that you will get the reward with this specific movement or specific behavioral output that you have. And that's kind of the more emergent view of the nucleus accumbens that's been kind of relevant in the past, past 5 years. I would say it's still highly debated, and a lot of the details are really still trying to be kind of like ironed out. Yeah. And so there's a lot of really good science that's being done here, and I'm really excited to see.
So you mentioned earlier that this region also has something to do with the condition anhedonia or anhedonia.
Yeah.
Anhedonia.
Yeah,
I believe it's how it's said. And how does that play out?
So dysfunction within the shell.
Actually, and let's first quickly, for those that don't know, kind of explain what anhedonia is.
Yeah. So anhedonia is
essentially lack of motivation.
Yeah, it's a lack of
pleasure.
Yeah, lack of motivation, a lack of a pleasure for things that you did receive pleasure or motivation to do in the past. And so this is primarily associated with dysfunction within the shell of the nucleus accumbens, and we've seen that through diffusion tractography and personalized approaches to stimulation of the cell can actually lead to an alleviation of anhedonia. Yeah, and so it's about like reestablishing the firing patterns and connections within the shell, because one of the things that I forgot to mention is that the characterization of signals within the interaction of the shell is very context specific and has very particular bursts of firing patterns, as opposed to the core that's very stable. And so this is very unstable, which gives kind of a more room for that that volatility and
that
pleasure.
That it's almost like a noise layer, right?
Yeah. And I know it's also involved in particular mutations of enkephalin expression. So that's involved in that's a neuropeptide involved in pleasure and mood, and as well as perhaps lesions or dysfunction within the hedonia hotspot of the shell, to where you're not actually getting any of the evaluated emotional significance or salience of it to then send to the core to give rise to an actual entourage effects of complex synchrony within the brain that can give you a feeling of motivation.
See, that is interesting in its potential application to something like the nootropic IDRA 21 that you and I have been kind of interested in recently. Because I've heard several accounts from people, and again, this is a relatively understudied thing, but nootropic, but I've heard several accounts of IDRA 21 either being able to relieve anhedonia or causing and stimulating emotional responses that are abnormal, for somebody's behavior. Like normally they wouldn't have an emotional response to something, but they did on IDRA 21. And I'm curious if it has an interaction with specifically this brain region. That seems plausible and a fascinating area for further research.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I can't say anything with certainty.
Right.
But I would expect that as a component of the extended amygdala complex, its heightened emotional state would be able to reestablish a
It's almost like an indirect way of doing what you were talking
yeah
about with the stimulation of that
the shell.
shell.
Mm-hmm.
It's like doing it through the brain's own signals.
Yes, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna have to give that some further thought.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to do that as well because it makes sense, you know.
Yeah.
And there's not as much noise within the shell as there is the core, and so getting that direct stimulation from emotional um, stimulus is going to have a greater effect on the shell as a whole. Um, so I can see that having some interesting implications, and then as well as the the glutamatergic input from the from the infralimbic system, which is involved in like in fear and emotional evaluation as well. And so you're getting like this bidirectional, like two inputs converging onto the cell, giving it more of a stimulation from IDRA21.
We should look at in the future potentially doing maybe even just some. Doesn't necessarily have to be a full blown part of a podcast or a segment on our podcast. It could be its own separate series, but we should look at doing some videos on some neuroscience based practical ways that people can address some common issues, neurological issues.
Yeah.
Just try and give them at least the knowledge base and some of the areas, of research or things that research suggests that they could lead them to steps they could take to start resolving some of these things, like anhedonia, depression, ADHD, things like that. And that way they understand more of more of how these things work on a neurological level and fundamental level, and some of the different options that they have and how those would interact with that, that system.
Yeah.
Because I think that'd be very beneficial. I mean, I have ADHD and have had or have dealt with anhedonia in the past, and so I'm very sympathetic and can relate to that search for a solution.
I mean, it's very interesting because I would say that I had intense cycles of anhedonia, just a seasonal depression, if you will, where it's not like I had like brain fog and I wasn't working, like I wasn't like a functional human being, but I had zero.
It's more probably depression than anhedonia.
Well,
right?
The interesting thing is that nothing was interesting, It was more so like
But that is interesting because that's a common misconception about depression. Depression can lead to emotional distress.
Yeah.
But it isn't necessarily isn't always and doesn't necessarily involve emotional distress. It can be can be symptomatically a lack of ability to motivate.
Yeah. And I know another way of characterizing it is through the actual progression of things that used to make you feel good not feel good anymore over a period of time. And what I was going to say
I'd say that probably falls closer within the category of anhedonia.
Yes. And what I was going to say for me personally is that it took a very, very intense emotional context, environment, and grappling and wrestling with that very intensively to get over that lack of pleasure from things that I used to have and find purpose in life and be able
I
to
wonder if
have.
that's that emotional noise reconditioning.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely could be, because when you said about the idea array interaction, it's like
Mm-hmm.
the significant emotional stimulus and the things that maybe you didn't even think of before. That is very similar to my own emotional experience, and then the translation of that into very highly motivated states where I felt good doing things that that were new and novel, but also things that were stable and structured in my past as well. Being able to integrate all of that into one after that very intense emotional moment. And I wonder if it's like for like a personal, almost like evaluation of, is life itself, it's almost like a big question of if life itself is worth like continuing in a way, because it's like there
The
was like a
futility of it all.
mm-hmm, I'm not really sure how it played out in my mind, but there was almost like a transient feeling of like almost not really being in my own body, like the self disillusioned. I felt my emotions all actualize and then compartmentalize and then turn it all into like this kind of one kind of structured pursuit, which is very goal driven. It seems very much centered into action selection and then the evaluation of the emotions that then translate into behavioral programs that seems to be all be mediated by the Nucleus Accumbens.
I wonder if um, the kind of part of the development of the 5 personality type um, is caused by a lack of um, essentially finding the rest of life boring, but like
Mm.
a lack of ability of things to cause or normal things to cause pleasure and reward and kind of stimulate that system, because there is an almost inevitable uh, you know draw for 5s to very complex fields that have endless depths
Yeah.
to pursue. And so because of the fact that they end up finding meaning through and reward through this internal knowledge, like acquisition and processing, you know, we end up being driven towards pursuing complex fields that have an endless like depth of that to explore and find reward and meaning
Mm-hmm. Yes.
in. And so I wonder if like almost at a base level that personality is almost caused by a low level, not necessarily what would be classified as a you know um, diagnosable level, but like a low level like anhedonia or something like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah.
Um,
That's definitely something that I see could very much be true. It's 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 interesting when you kind of combine psychological aspects with the neurobiology of humans,
and
because
behavioral components.
yeah, the behavioral components. Because to me it's like when I look back at my own past, I didn't have very many significant actualized representations of goal pursuits or goals that I can pursue in my life until much later, until I was an adult actually. And I think for a lot of people that there was that emotional connection to something greater than themselves that they could pursue, that they uh, grabbed onto as a child, and then that kind of allowed them to not like glide through life, but be stable in what they are and the repetitive nature of their life, and then explore alternative routes that then kind of can correspond to that. And then you get this more low level, less complex, feeling of satisfaction and goal driven behavior that can, create a stable life, and you'll live and you'll feel great, and then you'll die and it's good. And then I think probably for some people that end up being fives is that there wasn't anything that they found of significant emotional relevance to grab onto for a while, and stayed in this very like highly observant state. And during very intricate, developmental stages, they progress into this state of like of limbo, of like almost understanding that,
enjoying the search.
yeah, enjoying the search. But when none of your questions are answered because you don't know how to ask them,
You enjoy the questions.
yeah, you enjoy the questions, and then over time you forget the questions, and then they were never answered, and then you kind of live life in this kind of repetitive, boring way that everyone else does, and you kind of feel like there's no worth and meaning in it until you're able to find that one thing that you're able to infinitely dive into that
Right.
answers those questions you had.
Or you find an area that has enough questions and answers within it
Mhm.
to provide you that drive,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's like the evaluation of the emotional significance of the questions to what's been answered, and then relating that to a specific behavioral program to better pursue that goal, and then it relates that to other various ways of doing things. So it's all very good.
Yeah. The
Sorry, my mom was texting me.
That's all right. The for me, I think there was also a component, is a conglomeration of things, like one of which I'm sure was as a child, feeling like I was subpar academically because I couldn't focus on things, and because I couldn't see the meaning in them. Like I didn't see the relevance to me, and I didn't care, and there wasn't enough reason to overcome my ADHD.
Yeah.
And
yeah, definitely.
and so I ended up feeling like I was, kind of very like there was not that I was stupid, because I knew I wasn't, but like more like there was something wrong with me. And but at the same time I was also told often by my dad, usually in times of conflict when I was being corrected for something, that I was a very smart kid, and yet so I had this like kind of dueling like reinforcement element to this concept of the importance of knowledge.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure there's that component there, and also both one of notable elements that I've seen in both of us, which I'm curious if it translates to like how much of fives as a whole this experience translates to, but having a singular experience, an overwhelming emotional experience that that prompted such a period of dysfunction that overcoming it required becoming a five, required a level of emotional regulation and logical processing that normally wouldn't be required all at once, but with such a heavy, stimulus that it kind of prompted that that path, so to speak.
It's almost like there was a slow progression of that type of alternative path, that might have been somewhat mediated by those D2 receptors in your nucleus accumbens.
It's like you were already kind of like had a somewhat of a bias towards that. Not necessarily a bias towards it, but like it was an option on the table.
Yes. Like I always, even before I really decided to pursue neuroscience, I was always very interested and would listen, like just over time, I wouldn't even think about it. I would just listen to different podcasts, like, maybe Star Talk every once in a while, or, a specific like neuroscientist would talk about
like
something.
The Science Channel.
Yes,
like
Andrew
all that
Huberman, I'd be like, oh, that's an interesting concept. And I would just think about it. I wouldn't really understand all what they were saying at all. Not really that much. But I was like, there's something about this that I really like listening to.
Yeah, it's almost like a natural kind of like...
Not even thinking about it.
Secondary interest or like a bent,
Yeah, and then like a very intense emotional response to the primary behaviors that you're outputting are not working. That then has to do a flip and
like,
find
my way of like...
the most, relevant
my way of
path.
navigating life is not functioning for me, and I don't want to experience this event ever again, or this level of dysfunction ever again. So what are the alternative pathways here that we can begin building or exploring?
And I mean, that's also very interesting, because if you think about the inhibitory projections of the nucleus accumbens, it can fundamentally inhibit all of the primary output responses that you have, and then focus on reconfiguring a better primary way of living your life and the goals that you have for yourself. And that seems very profound in the sense that that's something that we continuously do on a low level, and we try to change over time and match what we expect, and what we think is good and bad to some degree. And then whenever that just, I think there's something about that dramatic shift that then makes you grab onto the information that you've gathered in this alternative path that makes it more real than the primary one that didn't have any substance in it.
Yeah, because I did go through, interestingly, after that emotional period of kind of, it required reevaluation of the way that I was doing things and navigating life on a very fundamental level. I went through a period that I can actually viscerally kind of almost categorize of trying new personality, so to speak, kind of. Like during my live musician phase, where I was performing in front of people, I took on very much more a personality similar to like a 3. And kind of a very public, like all focused about my public facing self, and that the how I was being perceived and my professional kind of persona. And I tried that for a couple years. Then COVID hit, and I was forced to stop that because of there was no more live music scene, and was kind of sequestered indoors a lot of the time, and had a lot of time to immerse myself in things like programming and that stuff, more technical stuff. And during that time also started it was my first experience using like race TAMs. So I had put my brain in a state where it could it could relearn and adapt. And I adjusted again my personality at that point, starting to try out the 5 type
Mm.
behaviors, and found a lot of meaning and reward in that way of doing things and navigating life. And it kind of just reinforced itself to the point that it eventually like became my primary pathway.
Mm.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's very similar to my progression of living. Mine was interesting because my transition was a little bit more like I need to seek truth. I need to get rid of my biases completely and just look at information through a less presupposed lens that was given to me by my environment, and just continuously sacrifice my biases every day and come up with conclusions that were probabilistic in nature and were always open to new novel experiences and ideas.
And that was definitely a component for me too. Like
Yeah.
there was an element of there of questioning my previous
Mm-hmm.
beliefs and
Yeah.
like and then realization of the illogical nature of those
Yeah.
that then prompted me to like, oh, this is okay, true. Like I need to figure out what's real, what's true.
Yeah. Yeah. And my progression was very interesting because there was a level of, I felt like this was like a divine orientation towards understanding like heaven and earth and the conjunction between them, as opposed to logic, if you will, if that makes sense. I felt like it had a very big component, but I very felt like my emotions needed to be a guide, but not a component in my critical thinking, if you will. So I kind of put my emotions as like my god, and my critical thinking as like the servant to it, if you will. But it was through this weird kind of like filter effect where I felt like my emotions were speaking to me and giving me like a general plan, and my critical thinking had to just like really like just pursue whatever it was that I was feeling in that moment. And that led me down various weird paths. And then, when I kind of fully established myself as, someone who really wants to learn neuroscience, it kind of over time changed into once I kind of was grounded in real knowledge, then
It's almost like that placement of emotions at such a high priority caused such a strain on your processing and filtering systems, having to like translate that into some sort of useful action, that like it forced that system to become like stronger and like start to like develop certain abilities it wouldn't have been able to otherwise.
Yeah.
And then maybe eventually like kind of transition to change priority now to where like actually your filtering is carries more weight, than the emotions.
And I think you definitely played a pretty big role in helping me form a new perspective in the more analytical side of perceiving the world. And then, I will say that I really like that analytical, more logical perspective to things, because you might not think it, but it actually synergizes really well with my previous ways of thinking, if you will, because it just kind of gives me more flexibility in my behavioral options.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you just put high priority on the logical analytical side of things, I don't know, it works really well.
It gives definitely helps give more useful direction,
Yeah, exactly. Because I can feel like I have a more a purpose beyond myself, but within myself, and then that is subservient to the logic of reality, or at least my own understanding of it. Can't obviously get past it. And that's also one of the things about the Bayesian probability, or the Bayesian nature of our own existence, is updating prior beliefs based off of new information.
Those priors and posteriors, man.
Yes, and in essence, those are subjective, because it's because your evaluation is based on new incoming information, and so it can't in essence be objective, but you can live a lifestyle that pursues getting the most information to have the highest probability in things in life. And realizing that early on, I think for both of us really helped us maximize our own like understanding of how we want to live our lives. You know, thanks to the Nucleus Accumbens doing that.
And the you know, it's interesting because like our different pathways to getting where we ended up also kind of still hold representations in the components in ways that we differ.
Yeah.
You know, as similar as we are, like we have some nice differences in our kind of overall perspectives on things, or things that we like pursuing and whatnot. And you know, you definitely have more of a tendency towards the abstract, and you know, the more,
oh my gosh,
more out there and like less solid.
You should read this paper that I just wrote about taking pretty much a vacuum, a quantum fluctuation, quantum vacuum of a virtual
quantum fluctuation.
Yeah, a quantum vacuum with virtual particle fluctuation combined.
Quantum fluctuation vacuum. I love that. Sorry, go ahead.
Combined with a limitless space model that was proposed by Hawking, and then presupposing an axiom of the universe as a computational agent, and then synthesizing those views together to then like give rise to how we see the world. And that is probably one of the most abstract.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, a little bit of detail. There's this Launder's principle of like minimal energy expenditure of computation that can actually be so like there's the minimum energy for computation, and that can actually be what am I looking for? The right word to be like it allows this principle to be like true in the model. So pretty much the virtual particle fluctuation within the boundless
fundamental
like the minimum energy required for computation to be done, and then the loss, the entropic loss of that information can be supported and done by virtual particle fluctuation. And then you pretty much have a boundless space before the Big Bang, and so you have this infinite variety of potential computations that exist within this vacuum of endless virtual particle fluctuations. And like that is probably like, you know, that's just kind of, it's very abstract, you know.
That seems like it could be fascinating if I knew what it
yeah
was.
I'll send you the paper once I'm done with it. I'm still working through it myself.
Okay.
But yeah, anyways, continue what you were saying. I'm more abstract, you're more.
Oh yeah. No. And you know, those kind of are you know, the more that we interact, you know, and kind of, it was one of the reasons why we make, you know, great co-podcast hosts, because we generally see things from a similar angle but have different representations.
Yeah.
And you know, it would be boring if it were just two of me or two of you, you know, leading the podcast. And so it's I will say, you know, it is nice having that kind of representational difference there that kind of expresses itself in the nuances.
Yeah. In the future, I see a very nice convergence point.
Yes, where like we kind of navigate enough towards the other's way of doing things that we are able to more meet in the middle, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know?
And to me, that's probably the best way to do things, because if you're coming at it from a more in like a program computational perspective and me biological, if we meet in the middle and converge, we can actually give pressure to each other's ideas from different perspectives in a better way.
Relevant pressure,
Yeah, exactly. And so like we're already able to do that to some degree, but then once we kind of meet more, I don't know, that just seems like a really fun idea.
Speaking of which, I can't tell you how many times I think, man, I've got to get Jacob up to speed on programming, because
oh my gosh. Yeah.
there are so many things that I want to like bounce off you or like run by you, just have a sounding board on something, but like they're just gonna like not. They're too much in the field, you know, and you'd kind of have to. There'd be too much background required, you know, to get you up to speed on it. But
I don't have to work as much.
Yeah.
Hopefully in the near future. I don't know. We'll see.
I can't tell you how there's been several times when recently too with one of the as I kind of told you, and you were able to share in this a little bit, but
yeah, the phase line.
But not that. It was the new model architecture that I designed, and the improvements, you know, that I kind of made on it. And I finished this thing, and I figured out that it was viable, and that it was like a good idea and could provide a lot of value, and started kind of elucidating like all the, you know, the nuances and details, and came up with this beautiful like structure. And I was so excited and had nowhere to put it. Like I was like no one can understand. No one can understand why this is so beautiful.
Yes.
Like, and like, you know, I was able to share it with you a little, and you were kind of able to grasp the general concepts, but like
not the details that really paint the beautiful, intricate picture.
Right.
Yeah. One day I will get there, slowly but surely. And, you know, obviously I'm going to need to do like computational modeling of, you know, of various neuronal systems. And so that's going to translate into my understanding of, you know, programming, obviously. And then that's also another cool lens, because, you know, now we have 2 lenses on programming as well.
Yeah. And 2 lenses on neuroscience. It's like very, very complimentary there.
No, yeah, I definitely agree. It'll be really cool. And then I want to, you know, I wouldn't say you're less abstract. It's more so like your abstractness is more so grounded in real principles that you're able to then correlate with like real functions that can be useful.
Yeah.
And so in that way,
practical abstraction.
I find that you're honestly your creativity is much more useful. If that makes sense.
I think
you know, it's like, it's not less creative, it's more so like creativity that's grounded in like real models that you can then create.
Yeah,
you know?
utility based creativity. You know, that's another fascinating concept, the kind of what is creativity, what makes creativity, you know, possible. And in essence, kind of, you know, creativity is like in kind of its base sense often is branching outside of the norm.
Yeah,
you know, it's like it's almost like a level of noise, but the way that it often plays out in a, you know, practical kind of sense in our lives is a noise that has meaning or purpose, a noise that leads to something meaningful or purposeful.
Yeah.
And so, like, you know, that's kind of like you see a great example of this with artwork and paintings and whatnot, which I'm not personally into, but like I think are useful representations of. I mean, I am into artwork a little bit, but like not on a level that's, you know, like it's an interest or something.
Yeah, I suck at drawing.
But the
horrible.
When you look at abstract paintings, they have less and less oftentimes they have less and less relevance and resonance with general populations. The more abstract and kind of out there that noise, that noise leads them to become. And there's an optimal kind of level of noise to useful output that still has relevance to something. Like it can lead you to a different way of doing things, like with the Nucleus Accumbens, and the D2 receptors. There can be a level of noise that is useful to leading you to a different path that hasn't been done before, or a different conclusion, and that can actually be a useful path. There's also a level of noise that can lead you towards a really unproductive or like not very useful path. And it's all about finding that balance to provide the right level of noise to finding that optimal pathway.
And it's interesting because we don't often think about this, is that these alternative paths and expressed in D2 receptors are projecting into oftentimes unconscious processes. And so because you want to attenuate for quicker responses to alternative paths, if the primary path doesn't work, if there's level of surprise that needs to then rely on the alternative paths, they need to be already situated there, but aren't making noise within your actual conscious state of flow. And this is actually this also happening in longer time windows as well, not just in the state of your current moment, but also like short-term, medium, and long-term goals. And so you're getting not just from like a behavioral perspective, but from an actual creative perspective in the way we actually think and synthesize information and configure it. And then through that primary expression of pursuit, you're also attenuating cortical regions that are then going to, if given the right stimulus, going to create that aha moment, the connection you've never ever even seen or heard or thought of before, because of your unique subjective perspective on everything and the distributions of different responses to those ideas.
Creativity is almost like structured noise.
Yeah, definitely.
It's like noise that has a certain level of structure and relevance to networks that are being fired. And the more relevant structure you can create within that noise, the more meaningful output that you'll get.
And the more primary dopaminergic signals you can give to it, that can create an environment for learning and possibilities and exploring that potential reward through creative expression. It's so fascinating.
And
it really is.
One of the reasons that I feel like neural networks have such a difficulty kind of capturing the same level of intricacy as human creativity, as represented within human creativity, is because usually neural networks are designed on large data sets with large average conclusions, being drawn as a result, or like, finding the most frequent, outcomes. But there is kind of a level of, and then you can kind of simulate a level of creativity within that by adding noise, to the input or the signals as they're passing through the network, to lead to different, conclusions that might not have been arrived at otherwise. So you can simulate that component of it. However, what you cannot simulate yet with that is the variations, the minute variations in large network structures that results from our individual experiences and perspectives and personalities
Yeah.
and even genetics. But like you know, there you have much less within a model. You cannot like simulate that kind of experiential variation.
Yeah.
And even within like fine-tuned models, if I were to take somebody else's model that they've already trained and then train it on different data or more kind of tuned data to create this fine-tuned model, I would get a level of difference there. Like I would get a level of kind of, in essence, individual creativity, but nowhere near the extent to which human brains differ.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because human brains differ in more than just individual weights. They differ in structure as well.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's so insanely different and complex, and you're right in the sense that we can't model it yet on even very very advanced and very cutting edge neural networks, and we're getting there. We're getting really close, but the relevance to creativity itself, and our ability to create patterns that weren't in our training data, if you will. And a long-winded answer would be, think about the continuous raw sensory data that you're always constantly processing over long periods of times with very selective mechanisms in your thalamus that are then sending those process signals to other very highly processed regions that have a tripartite integration, not just with the neurons, but with the astrocytes and the microglia and the extracellular matrix that exists in between these neurons, and then the variations in different types of signaling cascades and regulatory networks. And then all of that correlating with the insane amounts of individual subjective experience, and then communicating with other subjective experiences, and then synchronizing with that and seeing how those collectives collide, and then giving rise to these emergent properties of creative, very intelligent and real expressions of computation that if modeled would be revolutionary, I think, in the field of in machine learning, but is just kind of currently just something you have to almost sit back and marvel at, because trying to wrestle with it just makes your head explode in the best way possible.
Yeah. There's an interesting question can kind of, arise from that conversation, which is, are we able really ever to create anything that is truly unique? Like, are we able to synthesize something new, or is everything that we do simply a overlay of impressions and experiences? So like, I create a piece of artwork. We'll use that as example again. Create a piece of artwork. Nothing ever like it, visually on a meta level has been created before. But is it really new? Is it new because it is combining elements that from things that I like, that I've pulled from other people? So I'm essentially copying a lot of what that is off of other people and overlaying it, with kind of my own personal emotional noise and experiences, so there's there's a component within that is probably a unique representation of me because it is that emotional experiential component, but the thing as a whole is largely just copying and combining things, which brings us back to that conversation about creativity, which is structured useful noise based off of your experiences and whatnot. Like that is an instance of structured useful noise. You are using things that you like and components that are meaningful to you emotionally to provide a level of structured noise that then creates something new.
Defining new is it's hard because you're right, on a meta level, it's, even if it is from particular impressions of other people's artworks that you've had in the past, converging those together, does the integration equal its components, right? Especially when you add that layer of subjectivity to you.
Do we define new as something with any amount of any level of component that hasn't been combined before as a static thing where that's the case? Like, so like just as a kind of on a computational level, if one number is different than every other version of this matrix that we've seen, does that qualify for us as something new and kind of unique? And if so, it doesn't take much to be unique. And if not, and it's not a static thing, but rather a threshold or like a range, then where do we draw that, that subjective line?
Yeah. It's interesting, right? Because my initial kind of thought is like, well, does there have to be, does new and unique have to be the exact same? Can it be that a new pattern of expression is in itself truly novel? And even if it lies in a potential state from previous convergence, that actualizing that into the real world could mean that, yes, on like a simple level, it would be new and novel. But there's almost like an element of determinism that almost gets in the way of that view.
I think if we're looking at like them strictly from a definition point of view, new and unique have to be the same thing. But if we are looking at them, because that's what they mean, they both mean the same thing. But however, if we're using them from a contextual, like representational point of view of how we typically use the word, I would say unique would probably encapsulate more of a subjective threshold kind of version of new. So like new would take on more of a defined kind of form, and then unique would take on more of a threshold subjective form. Where if somebody says something isn't unique, they're kind of almost defining this threshold in their head of what qualifies as unique.
Okay, I can see that. I guess to me, new is a layer and unique is more so like a niche, if that makes sense. A unique way of doing things that usually leads to something that is new. But it's more so like new is the actualized states and unique is the process by which you get it, if that makes sense. And I would say that the uniqueness would almost be the convergence of of prior, impressions that then actualize into a truly novel substrate that obviously has dense connections to the prior beliefs, but is an emergent property in and of itself. What do you think about that?
So you're saying you unique is almost a variation within a dimension of an overarching thing, and new is the resultant thing
Yeah.
itself.
Mm-hmm.
So if we imagine a cube, a Rubik's cube style cube made up of a bunch of different colors, unique could be a variation in the amount of colors within a specific dimension of that cube, and on a specific layer, or maybe multiple specific dimensions and specific layers. And then the new would be the component or the whole object, the whole cube that results from that variation.
Yeah, the specific expression of those unique color patterns. It's like the process by which a new thing is done and created. And I'd
say that's no less valid than what I said. So.
No, yeah, 100%.
Like they both seem. I don't think this is something that we as a human race have really are defined, or we are able to find, because the human race hasn't really defined it, like that.
Yeah.
I think both are probably valid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just like the
interpretations.
I like to view everything as a process, and then the functional result of that process that then leads to more unique processes, if that makes sense. But like the picture of the consolidation, or the singular convergence point that then creates something, is what is novel. But it's separate from the process. That makes sense, because it's made up of those prior impressions or belief states of subjectivity. But the end result necessarily is it's continuous. Yeah. I think it just, I see a nice clear progression there.
But the interesting part about like our discussion on that is the fact that while that makes sense, for us and whatnot, if we were to define things that way, the human race as a whole treats these terms as defined things. Like, that's not new. That's not unique. Like, do something unique. Like, or I created something, something completely new. And so we treat these things as like kind of these almost static, like definitions and components, when and like it's something that is easy to define and hard to achieve. When with both of our definitions, that's not the case. Like, if we take it as just variations within a structure that creates a whole that results in something new, that's easy to achieve. That's not hard. And if we take it in my context, like there's a new is being defined as something, as a defined state is something that has never been, conceived of before and hasn't built off of, something else.
Yeah.
And then, you have unique that is more of a relative, kind of term.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in both of those cases, their way of using it doesn't make sense. Of using the term, like, really, kind of doesn't make much sense. And it's just one of those interesting things that, like, it's one of those abstract elements of human expression. We say things with certainty that don't have any certainty.
Yeah. Well, I think that also leads to just the belief state and the inability to update them based off of new information instead conforming
Classic
it.
human condition.
Classic human behavior, right? I mean, it's interesting, right? Because, as we've kind of been talking about the nucleus accumbens, from just a simple, fundamental physiological perspective, it should seem like we're curated for updating ourselves and creating new novel expressions of ideas and understandings of how to interact with our environment for the rewards that we hold dear to our hearts. And the key component there is the last part, what holds dear to our hearts. It's like, is it our own ego? Is it our own self-worth? Is it our own understanding of reality? Is it our own, like, social environment? Because that's another big thing is, like, I forgot to mention this, the nucleus accumbens. There's actually a lot of oxytocin receptors within it that very much mediate social bonding and behavior.
You love me. We're a happy family.
And the nucleus accumbens is really trying to maintain that happy family state, and it will sometimes put a lot of emphasis on the social bonding aspect of behavioral goals. And so if that is emphasized, then oftentimes we will conform our belief updates to the collective, which sometimes is a good thing, but oftentimes can hide us from the truth, because we are only updating our beliefs for the service of whatever the cultural behavior of that time is. And so that can cause problems, and you have to kind of step out of that if you want to update it as a whole.
Cultural pressure to create a belief that isn't useful.
Yeah, or a relationship with the God that could, I don't know. Listen, I don't have any problem with religious people, but perhaps you should allow him or your idea of him to be more expressive and less consolidated.
Yeah,
to
more
a particular
more
narrative.
flexible.
Yeah,
And, open to
or at least
other interpretations or
at
questions.
least your own understanding of divinity, right? Like, I feel like that's why.
Why would we ever assume with something so complex that we instantly knew enough to consolidate a truth on the subject? You know, like Okay, in neuroscience, there are still so many areas that we don't know, of things that we don't, we don't know, and things that we think we know that we're still kind of unsure about. And so it's important to, like, keep everything, be open to, like, new interpretations, new evidence, new observations, and things that contradict, previously held beliefs. It's just an important kind of component to making sure that you're not blind, and and kind of are able to see things how they are. And in the case of something, as claimed complex, as a deity from another dimension, where the evidence is so much less, the observable evidence is so much less, you would think that would be even more the case, or would be necessary to be even more the case. But oftentimes, what we see is a inarguable, unyielding conclusion about how things are.
I mean, it's interesting because if you see the progression towards allowing new novel information to update your prior beliefs, you get a nice kind of equilibrium of agnosticism that always comes out, because you actually allow your prior beliefs to update based off of new incoming evidence, and then you have to wrestle with that. And some people come out being like, oh yeah, I am almost like 90% sure there is a God, or I'm almost 100% certain there is a God, and I'm going to live my life believing there is, and that's okay, because it's all subjective and about your own perspective on things. And
Yeah.
I wish people would allow themselves to not be constrained by their own like social and behavioral phenomena that suppress almost creative thinking and updates of beliefs.
And I can say, having been somebody that comes from this perspective, and remembering what that's like, that agnostic, people that are agnostic within the Christian community perspective are treated similarly to, like, basically the same way as somebody that doesn't, that says, no, I 100% believe there isn't, like, there isn't a God. And but agnosticism is essentially saying, I can't come to a conclusion on this subject because I don't have enough verifiable evidence.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that is completely different than, in my opinion, coming to a solid conclusion, no, I don't think there is a God. It's just as bad and limiting as saying
100%.
as saying I 100% know there is a God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, their agnosticism is maintaining that state of recognized uncertainty.
Yeah. It's almost interesting because it's just religious people just have more of an incentive to get you on their side as opposed to the atheists. But
we don't care.
Yeah. But if an atheist organization was like, oh, you don't believe that there fully isn't a God? Like, why would you even, be agnostic?
Knock, knock, knock. Have you not heard about Jesus Christ?
Yeah. Well, say no more. We'll make you forget him even better. And if you don't, then Darwin will be really sad.
There's
something
a
along
special
like
place just for you.
Your genes will mutate if you don't become
if you
an atheist.
Don't forget this.
Yes. And if that was the case, I'd be like, well, no, I'm not going to become an atheist because I haven't had enough verifiable evidence to become like a full-blown atheist. And I would say the exact same thing to the religious folk. It's just not often put in that perspective because, like you said, atheists really don't care. And the majority of them are agnostic and then get labeled as atheists, and so it's just there's less of like a, hey man, if you don't become an atheist, you're gonna go to hell. It's like, well, there's no hell. So, and I, even if I was religious, I don't, like, even when I was religious, I didn't believe there was a hell anyways.
And what's frustrating to me is not that they hold a belief so close that they're unwilling to change it, but it's more of the behavioral output that comes from that, like the inability to have a meaningful discussion about the topic because of the fact that those beliefs are so consolidated and not open to new information and ideas and evidence. Like, there is an instant emotional rejection to anything that conflicts with it. And so it bypasses like logic and processing, which makes it very difficult to like have any sort of useful discussion. Which is kind of one of those core weird components we have to grapple with as humans, that while we can be positively and negatively influenced on a lot of different levels by other people, when it comes to our core components and our core values that we believe are fundamental, our operating principles, so to speak, the large majority, if not all the time, we are the only ones that can change that. Like it is, there's not enough, enough significant relevant stimulus achieved through the influence of other people to shift those values. It's something that a conclusion that we have to come through almost through uncontrolled distress and discord within our value system. So like seeing that our current way of doing things is not maintainable. Like it's not a maintainable way to live. And that level of hardcore distress is enough of a stimulus that it can sometimes cause reevaluation of those fundamental beliefs, but just through discussion and influence, like from other people, like for most people, those values are way too consolidated for that to, even influence them.
It's interesting because to me, it's almost like we have the illusion of diverse thinking that can allow us to really create a structured, not just itself, but also a society as a whole. But it's almost like the cultural discussions we have are so rigid and not flexible, yet so noisy that nothing actually, and meaningless. There's no substance to the noise either. And so you have this like weird dichotomy of like dual repetitive structure within like our repetitive lives and the repetitive nature of cultural discussions that then kind of just gives us emergent, functional behavioral property of just almost like acting like in essence, like a robot,
It's like unstructured noise that we assign high value to. For some reason. Like
some reason.
It's the cultural, like it's the actually that we assign high value to cultural opinion and the importance of integrating within a culture. That's like the kind of the core driving component there. I think that that means that if the culture values this, if this is something that the culture is valuing, this is something that I need to value. And regardless of the fact that the thing itself is meaningless, it's the fact that the culture values it that's meaningful, and so we do it for the sake of integration with culture, and then don't question it because it's one of those things that just helps us live.
And for a lot of people, they don't even know where to start. They don't know where to start questioning it because, first of all, the majority of information doesn't come from discussions like we're having based off of, just logical inference and deduction. It comes from informational noise from the internet, which
from friends, family, church.
Friends or family and church that are all getting all of their information from the internet. And it's kind of like just repetitive all around that, thinks that has the illusion of substance, but doesn't. And when you look for the substance, you can't find it anywhere because everyone else is in that same issue and just,
so they don't look for the substance.
Yeah. And so they don't. And it's almost like there's a component of losing like social stability if you do look for that substance.
Yeah.
Because that's what happened to me. I felt like for like a little bit, there was like a dual component of like, wow, this is so new, novel, and exciting of how I'm viewing the world because it's so different from anything else I've observed. But at the same time,
I also can't talk about it with anybody.
Yeah, it made me feel very lonely.
Yeah.
In a way too. And I was always looking for other people that viewed things the same way as me, and then I gave up. Then I found you, and I was like, oh, grid.
I remember the first time that I found somebody that had come to similar conclusions about the beliefs they were brought up with, you know, as a child, and had kind of gone through a similar process. And it was like so therapeutic because I'd gone the entire time up until that point feeling almost like this level of shame, like,
yeah,
and kind of like almost like taboo outcast, like kind of thing where I was like doing something wrong even though I wasn't, like, you know, it's like this kind of element of like nobody understands me, and if I speak about this, I'm going to get it's going to change people's, you know, perception and opinion of me. And then, you know, realizing that somebody else also had come to the same conclusion, and it wasn't just me. And what was very like it was very comforting and very strengthening too, allowing me to kind of get to the point where I realized I don't care actually if this changes people's opinion of me, because if it does change their opinion of me, those people aren't people I really want to be friends with anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
And I can see and feel comfortable with the conclusion, you know, that I've come to, or the reevaluation, you know, that has happened here. And it makes sense within the framework in which, you know, I'm operating. And so if people don't like that, they can kindly, you know, fuck off. Like,
yeah, exactly. There is something nice about, you know, kind of rethinking things and being alone for a bit, because that aloneness kind of gives you some protective barriers that you can surround yourself with that kind of make you okay if people like disagree, or if, like, try to shame you for thinking differently than the cultural norms, you know, whatever they are. And I think that's not even
reinforces like the fact that you are of your certainty. It reinforces like your certainty about it, because the fact that you're able to maintain it in a state of that outcast kind of state, or that that antagonistic kind of state, means that that is a conclusion that is something that you are not just, you know, making on a whim. It's something that actually makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that. It's I don't exactly know where I lie on the spectrum. It's one of those, like,
what spectrum?
The spectrum of where to consolidate my meta perspective on life itself and its role in the universe at large. You know, my own perspective, everyone's perspective, the initial states that configured life itself in the universe, the known universe.
I would say
at least
that in and of itself is, in essence, a perspective.
Yeah.
The inability to consolidate something is a recognition of lack of information, which is a respectable perspective. Like,
I definitely think so as well. It's nice because, you know, no matter what information you come across, it doesn't really bother you. You know, you can kind of just put it in your respective place.
Yeah.
You know, like, I'm very much interested in diving into the theological implications of various religious texts. And taking that for what it is doesn't necessarily affect my ontological view of my experience, but it updates particular thought patterns and, my understanding of psychological thought processes and reaching up towards something greater than what we are now, and the anthropomorphic projections that we give that, and its utility, of course, and its wisdom sometimes, but
there's no reason why that element of kind of the historical element of history of religion, or the even the storytelling component of religion necessarily should be ignored, because you can still find a certain amount of like relevance and meaning. Like when I if I were to reread like portions of the Bible, what I would be thinking now is like, I wonder why these stories were developed and how they changed over the years to serve a specific purpose.
The evolution of
and
the
kind
text.
of where the culture was at, where that story was needed at the time.
Yeah. I mean, you can see that very prominent in the Buddhist texts. Why it was needed, the change that caused. It came from it, as well as like the biblical narrative. Both the Old and New Testament, honestly, give structure to a people group.
And you can see like you can see within each of those like periods that's recounted in those stories, like these representations of the culture, and the purpose of the narrative within that story was to address the problems within that culture of the time. It was to try and influence or reach people in a meaningful way, in order to kind of navigate these different social or cultural scenarios that were popping up and or becoming problematic, and so they served a specific purpose within that culture and in that time period, and that's very clear and represented in a lot of the stories, which is interesting and it's fascinating in its own right. But at the same time, I think it's foolish to assume that needs to have relevance in and direct application to today's culture.
Or direct application to the nature of reality.
Exactly. Like it's not a definition. It's not a descriptor of reality and how to navigate it. It is a perspective that is useful given a certain scenario.
And scenario was that people can't, or at least the majority of people need a story to hold on to, so that they can actually integrate.
They need
their
something
life.
that makes sense within their framework and their worldview. Like if I were trying to influence today's culture, first off, it would be much more difficult considering how many different worldviews there are. But if I were trying to influence today's culture within a specific circle, I would adjust my my assertions and my story that I was pushing to fit within the framework that they can understand and that they would resonate with. So if I was trying to influence the Christian culture to something, I would frame everything in a way that would make sense, to them, and would resonate with them for the purposes of achieving a specific shift. And and the difference for me is that you can't, you can shift, you can cause cultural shifts, but you can't cause you can cause immediate cultural like shifts, but you can't cause immediate cultural changes. Like,
Yeah.
you can't just change their fundamental perspective and worldviews on things all in one go, but you can shift them, in a direction.
Yeah. And there's natural progression towards it, and many different people have called out the change that is actualizing, through the death of God by Nietzsche, or various musings on the solipsistic or nihilistic views on life, and those philosophical musings emerging, exploring different alternatives that match better with reality, even if they don't paint the correct picture. But you can see, that over the past maybe like 400 years or so, there's been a little bit of there's been change in the way we view things. And I do wonder, like, over time, like, there's the personal relevance of our change in perspective, and we can say it's much more advanced in the current state, or maybe just different. And I do wonder where people will lie and how they will view things in the generations to come, and if it'll be good or bad or worse, or there will be a recurrent relapse into a more a primal state of thinking. Like, who really knows? But it's going to be interesting to see how all of that plays out. Personally, I'm not really sure. I'd like to be hopeful that people will be a little bit more unified in variation itself, like unified by their understanding of a chaotic volatility that exists underlying their underlying thought itself.
Unified in uncertainty.
Yeah, exactly. Where it's like, for a group that defines the cultural common sense, right? There's a sense that, like, oh, people say all the time, common sense isn't common anymore. It's like, well, no, actually, it's very common. It just is relevant to the state by which the culture presupposes information on you, and then you live based off of that information. That is common sense, not necessarily the sense itself. And
right.
So
it's not logical sense. That's not what common sense means.
Exactly. And people often confuse that. And we need to realize that it's actually the unified understanding of how we give information to the generations that then give common sense. And if that unified narrative is about understanding the volatile uncertainty of our own existence and then wrestling with that, then there's kind of a more dynamic culture we can live in that still gives a unified understanding of connection, but then allows for diverse and free thinking that can actualize into whatever it wants, which I think would be the best way to go about things. But we'll see if that ever happens. Probably not.
Yeah. One of the logical issues that I was just thinking about a second ago that I wrestled with for a while with, like, the Bible, and not limited necessarily to the Bible. I'm sure it's in other religions too, but this was the one that was relevant to me. Was the fact that people believed the things that were said by characters within the Bible as truth, despite the fact that it's was recorded years ago and by other people, and that it's been translated and yada yada yada. Like, history has a large history of being, like, recorded and kind of having a specific piece of information left out or exaggerated, and that's well documented, but that's for them that isn't applicable to the Bible. And the reason why, like, if you ask why do you believe this is this is truth exactly as it is, like, the answer is often, well, because God was speaking through these individuals, and God doesn't lie. And it's like, well, why do you believe that God was speaking through these individuals? Because it's in the Bible, and the Bible doesn't lie. Well, why do you believe that everything in the Bible is true, and why doesn't the Bible lie? Well, because it says it's true in the Bible.
Yeah.
Like, it's like this circular logic of like A leads to B leads to C leads to A. You know?
Yeah. And it's there definitely are, like, if you were to talk to a theologian, they'd be able to give a very beautiful, elegant answer to that question. But it also goes to show that, and that doesn't mean that it's true that they're able to give elegant answers to that question, but the average person is never going to be able to answer that, because,
well, even a theologian isn't going to be able to answer that. They might be able to wrap it in something a little more well thought out and
like
put together.
the synchronous connectivity between the Old and New Testament that gives rise to a
No, it's not even
truth.
just that. It's the
well, that's an argument, but
the synchronicity of the Bible as a whole and the books of the Bible, and what makes them valid and not like parts of history in the Bible, as opposed to, you know, other variations of it that could have happened, and what makes the stories within those books like 100% accurate when they were told by flawed individuals with flawed memories, and like
you just have to believe
in
man.
their own world interpretations,
Just-
you know?
Just
And that's my point, is like people will say, well, God was speaking through them. Like, says who?
them.
How do you know? It's them? Because they're the ones that
No.
like
You're not supposed to think. You're supposed to believe. Believe. Just accept without any thinking.
and it really
Just
is like
accept it.
often results like in kind of the desire to like both the desire to like have that belief and to hold on to something, and you know, have that
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
I don't want to say crutch, but like, you know, that kind of comfort of like a life after death and an all-knowing father figure that loves and is all hunky-dory and whatnot, in that comfort, and that they find meaning in life and whatnot, along with the cultural kind of pressure for that, results in, you know, kind of a both emotional need for that thing, as well as this level of weird emotion-based evidence for them. Like, it's emotion-based evidence, like, oh, I can
Completely.
feel God speaking to me. I can hear God talking to me, you know, and things like, it's like, in a scientific sense, that is no different from placebo.
Yeah.
Like, and you're choosing to pay attention to the instances in which, you know, whatever it was, whatever your feeling was accurate, and then you're assigning it to God speaking to you. There's no way for you to know that
Yeah.
that was anything but your own subconscious advising you. And so you're essentially placing like emotions in your subconscious as in the position of God.
Yeah, which is interesting, because I think before full manifestations of the frontal lobe and executive function, there actually were visual representations of anthropomorphic unconscious projections of telling people what to do, and that visualized itself as
Right.
deities.
We discussed that as like
Yeah.
the possible it possibly being psychedelics that weren't understood.
Yeah, yeah, psychedelics, or even the very psychedelic nature of our own uh, internal substances, like cerebral spinal fluid,
Oh yeah.
has dimethyltryptamine in it.
Yeah, I
Keep in
heard that
mind,
there's like a way that you can like stimulate your own.
I've done it before.
Have you?
It's an interesting experience. It really is, because it probably took me around an hour and a half of doing kind of uncomfortable and kind of painful breath exercises that had to do with like sucking your stomach like completely to your back and like pushing it in and like doing these weird patterns of breath expression. And then by the end of it, it's like you're in such a weird hypnotic state with like colors like starting to change, and you can like, you feel like it's like an out of body experience, you know. It's a really interesting it's really interesting doing that type of meditative practice. I did it once and I was like, that was cool and all, but I don't really want to do that again. It's just too much work. If it was like you could think and then just go into it, sure, whatever. But that just was too much work. But even then, it's just like the very psychedelic nature.
Give it to me in a pill form.
Exactly. Or a tea form, you know, take some ayahuasca. Be a good time. But then you'll definitely meet some deities. That's for sure. And are they real? As real as your subconscious projections are, I would say. And what is that made up of? Something that is inherently computational. I think there's an objective layer to it, but creates a subjective experience, you know? And so that is what's being actualized, not the objective nature of deities. Otherwise, you're made up of deities, which is just not true, you know? And not something that is found in any theological representation of any religion.
Right.
And so if you're going to go the logical route, saying you're made up of deities, it's just not true. You know, it's more so the nature of your limbic
Every
expressions.
cell in my body is a tiny little deity.
Yes, bunch of little deities all working together.
I am a universe.
I mean, you know, in some sense, yes, you are the universe, and that's great, and we get our own perspective on it. But does that mean that the nature of that universe is inherently like omniscient and omnipresent? It's like,
right.
Oh,
I think that there's a core component there. Is like, okay, I don't think like there are things that there are. I don't think that there are many things outside the realm of potential possibility.
Yeah.
That statement, though, does not mean I'm going to choose something as a reality.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
It is. I won't believe something unless I see a significant amount of reasonable, verifiable like evidence for it. And at that point, I will hold a level of belief in something. Like this is something that to my understanding is accurate, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I even then I won't like hold it as a universal truth.
Yeah.
You know? And it seems like concept that's foreign to, you know, a bizarre number of people, but you know, a level of recognizing other potential possibilities or the level of evidence
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
actually, you know, contributes and
Mm-hmm.
suggests. Because, like, for instance, somebody that had a spiritual experience on something and they saw something like with their senses they couldn't make sense of, haha. But then out of a desire to make sense of it, they come to a unreasonable conclusion on it
Yeah.
without taking the time to consider the other possibilities and and or recognize their own lack of enough information to keep that in a state of uncertainty. Like instead of just keeping it in the why did this happen state, their desire to store it away, and be able to categorize it and whatnot, leads them to coming to a preemptive conclusion on it. And instead of being like, all right, well, I don't know why this happened. Let me look into why these kind of things could happen. And what regions of maybe the brain this substance interacts with, or how this interacts with my body, and in order to better determine what's happening here. And then through that, you say, okay, here are my possibilities of what's going on here. Okay, well, it looks like there's a lot of documented evidence of, of these things controlling and modulating visual, receptor signals, and in the context of that, it would make sense why the brain would want to try and process this into something meaningful that it knew. And so that could be a reason why I'm seeing these things. I don't know, but like that could be a reason why, and it seems plausible. So I'm not going to come to a conclusion about it being a deity from another dimension.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you're almost, when you assign something to a metaphysical deity, it's as if you're taking the abstract notion of objectivity and assigning it to subjectivity, which then doesn't explain objectivity.
Right.
There's like a discontinuity there.
Often is fueled by an emotional, need to fill a missing component. I want to feel like there is meaning because I don't feel like there is meaning. I want to feel like there's something more going on here that, that I can't understand, or a direction to the universe, because I don't feel that. And so because this is in such a variable flux state, it makes it a perfect variable component that I can just stick anywhere. And so I'm going to fill this emotional need.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I hope, if anybody, listens to this, this,
anybody's out there,
if anybody's out there, please at least, allow new information.
Don't be afraid of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think that's probably the main issue, is that they feel like that their stability comes from certainty. And in a way, it's like, sure, but
certainty isn't a certainty. Certainty isn't a defined binary state.
Yeah.
Certainty is a range. It is a level.
Yeah.
It is I am fairly certain about this, or I'm more certain about this than everything else. It is a range, not a binary. And so, sure, chase certainty. Certainty is great. It helps us navigate life, helps us understand things, but don't treat certainty like a binary, because you're never going to be accurate in that. When you have all these binary certainties.
Yeah, because then you don't start to explore what you don't know.
Exactly, and you never adjust for what you don't know about what you do know. If you're certain about it, and new evidence suggests something, you won't know it because you won't consider it because you're 100% certain.
Exactly. And it's interesting talking with people who feel like they know the absolute truth, because it's like you almost can visualize the barriers in which they place their own understanding of reality. You can almost visualize it perfectly, and you're just like, do you not see the area in which you're not allowing yourself to think? And it's to me, it kind of is just okay, you can think that way, but my God, that seems so boring. It doesn't seem like something
Seems
you can
very
like.
limiting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't really understand how people can live their entire lives that way, but the majority of people do. And I do have some sort of empathy to that type of living. Of course, I understand life's tough. You need something to hold on to, but allowing yourself, very emotional or very, tough changes into allowing yourself to immerse yourself in uncertainty and allowing just the to just allow the flow of reality, the deterministic nature of it all, to just give yourself to it and ride it and see what happens instead of trying to escape it.
Yeah,
You know,
there's a
that makes sense.
certain beauty to uncertainty and
Mm-hmm.
and the unknown.
Yeah.
There's in essence, if I think we all like kind of rely on crutches and for in certain instances in our lives for certain things. And the like for me, my crutch is often curiosity. I use
Mm.
curiosity to motivate me and to give me purpose and meaning.
Yeah.
And in that sense, like the that's giving the pursuit of certainty and knowing kind of the priority there, because it's
Mm-hmm.
the thing I'm relying on,
Yeah.
in a lot of situations. And people don't necessarily have to go to that extent, but it would be nice if um, they would stop necessarily relying on such unreliable crutches
Yeah.
and instead kind of at least acknowledge the value of recognizing uncertainty.
Yes.
The You said something a second ago that was funny to me because the way you said it, you said, "Do you not see?" It reminded me of a quote from Lord of the Rings. Can you not see that your uncle is wearied by your malcontents, your warmongering?
Yeah. Yeah. I
It's a
mean,
Grima Wormtongue quote.
yeah. I mean, you can even see that truth expressing itself in narratives, which is why it grips people so much, because it's like, oh, there's substance in that. And, that's obviously translated to religious text. It's just allowing yourself to be a little bit more encompassing. And I just think that, it's hard because you have to really assign a lot of computational expense to maintaining this uncertain state of uncertainty, if you will. You
Yeah.
have to be uncertain. You have to be uncertain about your level of uncertainty, even, and it's kind of expensive to think that way for a long time.
It's kind of expensive.
It is.
It is.
Yeah.
It's very expensive,
Mhm.
but it's so important. Like there's it, and I think people would find that in relative terms, it's actually just equally as expensive to do that as it is to try and navigate life with binary uncertainties and dealing with the outcropping and repercussions of that.
Yeah, continuously trying to rationalize the irrational.
Right.
It's very computational.
Very
expensive.
computational,
Yeah.
and it's not beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
In this instance, it's computationally expensive,
Yeah.
but it's beneficial, and it helps you refine and and makes it easier to navigate things in the future.
Yeah, and the rewards become infinite in nature.
Mhm.
It's continuous self-actualization into the world of knowledge and understanding, which to me is better than rationalization of something that is so chaotic that there's no meaningful substance in it you can find.
Yeah.
At least on an intellectual level, and you
Yeah.
can find some emotional significance to it, but
It's like,
I don't know.
It feels like kind of, did you ever do as a kid scribble on a piece of paper and then try and find a picture within the scribble?
That's interesting. I mean, I've done that for like clouds, for example, like trying to find things in clouds,
Right.
but not for that
Yeah, no,
particularly.
we'd scribble
But
on a
yeah.
piece of paper, make just giant scribble, and then we'd like look at the lines and like try to find some meaning
Hmm.
out of it,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know? And that's
Uh-huh.
kind of what that feels like. It's like the whole as a whole, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean anything like it's chaos. Chaos there, you know, there is not in that specific thing, you cannot pull out a meaningful element. You might be able to find hints of things in there, but to pull out one element and then say that's what this is
Mm.
and say use it to describe the whole, is irrational. Like,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
and but observing the scribble and finding as many possibilities within it as you can. How
Yeah.
many things can you come up with within that scribble of possibilities there?
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe you draw another scribble and another scribble and another, and through the sheer accumulation of that data, you find a hint into your pattern, your own patterns, and
Your own
like
nature
your
pattern recognition.
subconscious,
Yeah,
like
yeah, that's interesting.
and that in like that's like kind of a good way of like visualizing what that thought process does.
Mm. Yeah,
Um,
that's actually really good. That's really good.
yeah,
And I think this is a good place to end it on.
yeah.
It's around 2 a.m.
Oh shoot.
Yeah, 1:58. But really, really great conversation,
Oh my
So
gosh.
totally worth
Time
it, in
flew
my
by.
opinion.
Whoa.
Seriously. I mean, we had a great conversation about the Nucleus Accumbens, its role as a highly processed information processor.
And what was great is it was relevant to the rest of the discussion.
Exactly. Yeah, it was really fun because we got to transition to understanding life through the perspective of uncertainty, and kind of taking the core principle model that a computational model that Nucleus Accumbens does, and then translating that to not just like low level uncertainty, but to the
Kind
a
of a
meta perspective.
metacognition level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Making sure that there is continuity and synchronicity between
Yes.
those, which is just interesting. Yeah.
So, on that note, remember this. Hashtag be Bayesian.
Yes. Yes, we need a little more Bayesian thinking in our lives. 100%. Yes. It's called being a Bayesianist.
Yes.
Yeah.
I am
Yeah.
a 100% Bayesianist.
Me too, and I think our brain is as well, which is why it makes sense.
That's why me and my brain get along so well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good friends,
Oh yeah, the best, very
Absolutely.
best. I say I almost. You've got some rivalry there with my brain. Like I don't know.
Some good friendly competition. If you
or
will.
unfriendly. Yeah. but
Unfriendly sometimes too, yeah. But all in good nature to some degree, maybe.
All
Uncertain
right,
about
guys. Thank you so much for watching, and we are super happy to have a stable
Yes.
podcast with
That's
stable
incredible.
audio
Mm-hmm.
and video, and we will now be coming to you regularly live again.
Yes.
And putting these out there. We're going to transition spaces again soon.
Mhm.
But we'll still be directly hardware connected.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't affect the stream at all.
Thankfully.
And yeah, thanks for watching. It's been fun.
Mm-hmm.
Join us again next week.
See ya.